Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn. What does the election of Donald Trump in the United States mean for trade between Canada and the US? Trump has spoken about imposing tariffs of 10 or even 20% on all products imported into the United States. He's described tariff as the most beautiful word in the dictionary. It's believed that Ottawa will try negotiating for exemptions for Canadian goods, but if we don't get them, is a trade war coming? What does Donald Trump's election mean for free trade? And if tariffs are imposed either solely by the US or in retaliation by Canada, what could it mean for Canadian consumers and businesses? Here today to talk about this issue are two trade law experts. George Reid is a partner with Bennett Jones, and Mark Warner is an international trade and competition lawyer with MAAWLAW. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Let's start with what Donald Trump is promising. So, George, let's start with you. On the trade front, how seriously do you think officials are actually taking this claim that he might impose tariffs of up to 20%?
I think they're taking officials are taking this incredibly seriously, and they really should. Donald Trump campaigned promising these tariffs 10 to 20% across the board, 60% on China, additional tariffs on Mexico. I think governments around the world have taken notice, and they are drawing up their plans as we speak.
So, Mark, George mentioned that Trump has said that these will be across the board. Uh, that's what he said. But do you think that there's perhaps an intention to make them more targeted? Do you think they will be targeted or across the board? And if they're targeted, what industries do you think would most likely be affected?
So I think the thing with Trump that I start with is that he is a real estate lawyer. He's transactional. He likes to negotiate. He's got conflicting motives. He likes to see the stock market go up. I think he's having a hard time selecting a Treasury Secretary nominee because he can't find anyone who seems to be able to agree with him that raising tariffs will not ruin his stock market, which is also a beautiful thing in addition to tariffs for him. That's part of the problem. But I also think what we learned with Trump 1.0 is while Trump is transactional, he's also prepared to throw the hammer down when he's confronted, when he's cornered. And so while I do think that the Ottawa officials are preparing, just as everyone else is, the worry that I have is that they're over preparing. And there's one of the problems with Canada is we share this media market with the United States. And so we are tied into every single thing they're doing, every cough, every twitch. And they're not really focused on Canada when they cough or twitch. But every time they cough or twitch, someone from the Trudeau government goes down to Washington, which means that we become the face of the resistance. My view is that's never the right place for Canada to be with Donald Trump. And so I think, yes, they are prepared, but I worry that they are repeating some of their past actions, which I think they think were successes, which they've convinced the Canadian media are successes, but I think ultimately went up the nostrils of Donald Trump and Joe Biden later on.
So, George, with respect to that, how officials are reacting? I mean, one of the potential ways of reacting is for Canada to take some proactive measures to perhaps diversify trade relationships so that we are not as affected by any trade action taken against Canada by the United States. Do you think there's any action like that being taken proactively to sort of diversify those relationships?
I think going back to sort of Trump 1.0 time, if we go back to 2016, that was kind of peak free trade agreement negotiation period, right? And following that, we had agreements with the European Union, with a number of countries in the Asia Pacific. Frankly, though, like our major top three trading partners are still the US, Mexico, and China. It's hard to get away from the US just because of the proximity and integration. And governments have talked for decades about we need to diversify. The fact is, we haven't seen that needle move substantially. Now, in the event that we are in an across the board 10 to 20% tariff land, maybe we'll see some real movement there. But sitting here today, I think we got to make a deal with the United States one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to evade the fate of geography that we have been dealt. with our proximity to such a massive economy. We've got to go to commercial break now, but when we come back, I want to talk about the way sort of the ideology around free trade has shifted in recent years. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing what the election of Donald Trump in the United States might mean for trade between Canada and the US. Now, Mark, for a really long time, free trade has been a really prominent part of uh, policy making, decision making, and in particular on the right of center. But now it seems like both the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States are talking a lot more about protectionism. They're a lot less friendly to free trade. It's curious to a lot of political observers that this has happened on the right and on the left. So maybe you can give us some big picture explanation of what happened and where have the champions of free trade gone?
Well, I don't I don't think that free trade itself was ever a really popular idea in the United States. There was a kind of an elite group consensus around free trade, which what made it very difficult for the Democrats is that they had this union and blue collar labor constituency that were at best conflicted on trade, if not mostly opposed to it. And then when their presidents would get elected, the presidents would see the bigger picture in terms of the global economy. Whether it's the tip of the classic case, I guess, would be Obama and Clinton. And then once in power as president, would become free traders. But sometimes we lose sight of that in Canada. That didn't mean the Democrats were free traders. The bulk of the Democratic Party never were. More Democrats voted against the original NAFTA agreement than voted for it. The Republicans were the party of big business, if you like, and banks, and they tended to have elites around it. Donald Trump came in and blew it up, and he said, "I can go after and get those blue collar votes too. I could even get some of those union members. Forget what their union leaders say. Those blue collar voters are going to vote for me." And when I get in power, I'm going to sort of, whether it makes any sense for the economists or the professors, I am going to have a kind of Democrat policy towards China and towards trade. And that's what's blown up the system. There is nobody left. Now, if you look at who voted for Trump in the last election, you could say, well, maybe the Democrats could move over and become the party of free trade because they essentially look like they've lost their constituency. But that's a very hard thing for a political party to do, and not clear that that would be a winning coalition. So I think for some time into the future, as long as Trump is there, and as long as the person who takes over from Trump on the Republican side sees those blue collar votes as ones that he or she can get, we're going to be living in this world where there isn't an anchor for free trade in the American politics.
George, what's your take on that? Do you think that the consensus around free trade, to the extent that there has been one on at least the right of center, do you think that has been blown up, or do you think we're going to see a return for free trade in sometime in the future from the political class, or is it is it done?
I feel that the lasting legacy of the first Trump administration is to reset how we think about trade deals, how we think about tariffs, and elevating the national interest over everything else. I mean, the idea that tariffs are bad in the US, that turning point was somewhere in the 1930s when they decided, hey, we should reduce tariffs and, make trade easier and it'll work well for all of us. The reality is 21st century, free trade has not worked well for everyone. It has worked very well for some, and it has left others behind. And I think a lot of politicians have come to that realization, and the realization that it is important to protect your domestic industries. And there's a related story to all of this, which is that governments in Canada and the US in the last couple of years have engaged in massive subsidies for domestic production. So when we're looking at those tariffs, you might also consider them, insurance for your investment, right? You don't want to try to create nascent industries, but have them competing with, obviously, number one on the list, China. So that dynamic of domestic subsidies for business needing protection from offshore imports, I think is going to stay with us throughout, what we call the energy transition, right? The need to build EVs and achieve a carbon neutral future. So as long as that remains the policy direction, I think we're going to continue to see tariffs used to shelter domestic industries that will benefit from subsidies.
Yeah, and I think China is absolutely engaging in that as well, right? It's not just Canada and the United States subsidizing domestic industries. China, of course, is as well. And a lot of Trump's rhetoric around tariffs relates less to Canada and more about China. I want to talk about that when we come back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing what the election of Donald Trump might mean for trade between Canada and the United States. Now, Mark, in the last segment, we were talking a little bit about China's role in driving Trump's rhetoric about tariffs. Now, of course, he's not talked about imposing tariffs exclusively on China, but it does seem to be driving his thinking. So, how does China fit into the economic calculus on tariffs, and how much of these tariffs do you think will be aimed more at China or versus aimed at Canada?
So I think it's worth thinking that two things happened in close succession in the beginning towards the end of the 90s. The WTO agreement came into effect. It was the high point of liberalized trade, if you like. The Americans had certain expectations of what that would mean in terms of access to other countries, had certain expectations of what it would mean in terms of the WTO system, which is very different than what the rest of the world thought that they had agreed to. Canada had a role in that in terms of a legalized dispute settlement system. Secondly, China acceded to the WTO and also around that time became a major exporter. And all of the worst fears of both of those things have really turned out to be the case. China has become a low cost producer and has shipped lots of stuff on the market. So they've worked their way into supply chains. Great for consumers, but it's actually decimated manufacturing in the United States and in other countries. And that's kind of what's driving a lot of this. So whether Trump can get it back by tariffs on China is another matter. What we're seeing is that production is moving to Vietnam, to other places in Southeast Asia, and to Mexico. And the question going forward, I guess, is going to be just how deeply does Donald Trump intend to go in taking China out of the American supply chain? If he goes very deep, then of course if you think of what Mexico and Canada were fighting the United States on in the first real dispute under the USMCA successor to NAFTA, it was over the rules of origin. I always call that a dispute over how much Chinese auto parts could really be counted as Canadian or Mexican. And we thought we won that case. And now basically the Americans have said, well, we're not implementing that. We did an agreement with Canada and Mexico, not with China. And now I think, from what I can see, the Canadian government seems to have thrown that overboard, not officially, but in aligning with American policy. So that's really the question are the Americans serious about taking China out of the supply chain? Very hard to do, will be very inflationary. And then the question for Canada will be, how far are we prepared to align with that? So far, as I said, we seem to be aligning with electric vehicle tariffs and electric vehicle parts tariffs. As I said, that I don't know whether we've formally thrown that rules of origin case overboard. And we've made some changes around Investment Canada and how we deal with Chinese investments by state-owned enterprises and critical minerals. But have we really taken China out of the Canadian supply chain? And that's going to tell a lot in terms of how Americans, I think, react to the Trudeau government. I also think it tells a lot of why in these early days after Trump's election that the Liberal government seems to be on every flight to Washington, because they know that the Trump people associate them as being very pro-Chinese.
Now, George, I'm curious if the Trump administration does impose tariffs on Canada, either targeted or across the board tariffs. How likely do you think it is that Canada would retaliate with our own tariffs? And if we do, what impact could we expect that to have on businesses, on consumers, and at what point do these escalating tariffs become what we would call a trade war?
So I think we'll take history as our guide. We've seen this movie before, at least in part in 2018. So the U.S. put steel and aluminum tariffs coming out of Canada. In response, Canada says, okay, well, we're going to hit you with tariffs on steel and aluminum. But then there was this other like laundry list of goods that they listed. It was a list-based approach. So we're talking like yogurt, coffee, whiskey, mattresses, dishwashers, parts of boats. So all of that weird list-based stuff was basically trying to put pressure on members of Congress and the Senate to basically convince the Trump administration to lift these tariffs in Canada. And ultimately, the way Canada got those lifted was that they withheld signing the USMCA until the US lifted the tariffs. So what I expect is how Trump operates. I'm going to put tariffs on you. I have leverage. Now we're going to negotiate. So Canada's going to want to put something else on the table to bargain with. I anticipate it will be list-based because if we go across the board on US goods, the consumer is going to feel it and feel it pretty hard.
We've got to go to commercial break now, but when we come back, I want to talk about the renegotiation of the USMCA. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing what the election of Donald Trump might mean for the trade relationship between Canada and the United States. Now, George, Trump has famously called NAFTA the worst trade deal ever. There's a new deal that replaced it, negotiated in part by the Trump government, the USMCA. Now, I know that deal is up for a review beginning in 2026. I think that there's already consultations beginning. Trump was involved in this deal, but has he otherwise expressed views on how it's going? Should we be concerned that there might be a wholesale renegotiation? I mean, even if it was Trump's deal, that doesn't mean he's not going to still be critical of it. It's kind of the peculiar nature of that individual. He's sometimes unpredictable. So, any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, so I think Trump has been very promotional towards the USMCA, but mainly because he ripped up the NAFTA. We haven't heard a lot from him about what that issues are going to be in that particular review as yet. He's got to be careful. He's identified himself with the deal. So we would expect that he may, deflect the blame and say that Canada and Mexico, they're abusing or they're taking advantage of this perfect deal that I made. That's the kind of line that I would anticipate. In terms of where the issues are, I think Mark was talking about rules of origin and autos. 100% is going to be right back on the table. And there's a number of trade irritants that are just building up. So just looking at the US-Canada example, the digital services tax, right? The Americans absolutely hate that act. That's going to be a hot button issue. And then you've got like the long-term trade irritants that just never seem to go away. So supply management, right, is always enemy number one in these trade negotiations. We don't expect anything to be different other than the Americans to press even more firmly on opening up Canada's dairy market and other supply managed market to US goods.
I mean, I don't see that happening. I don't see Canadian officials agreeing to that.
No, and it's been very fascinating to watch the block bill go up to the Senate, right? Which was an attempt to basically prevent the government from ever negotiating away supply management ever again. And to see that get more or less eviscerated, I think was the word that the block leader used, or something of that nature in the Senate, because why would you tie your hands negotiating in that particular manner? And I agree, but we'll see what kind of pressure Trump is willing to bring to bear this time around.
Mark, any comment on what we might expect to see from the USMCA review, or maybe an indication of the approach Canada might be taking? I know there's been some suggestion that Canadian officials are already throwing Mexico under the bus. What's your view on that?
Well, I do think that, on the record and off the record, I think the Canadian government has been seen to be trying to throw Mexico under the bus, along with various provincial premiers. But that's not new. Canada has never really wanted Mexico in this relationship to start with. So from my long vantage point, I would say that's not really new. But Mexico is helpful because I think Georgia talked about this a little bit. But the way we got out of the last time round of negotiating with Donald Trump was Canada took a very firm way of negotiating. We put nothing on the table of a market that we might open, which of course leaves the only other things to talk about are the things they already find to be irritating, like supply management. And then, it was basically no, 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 no. That was Christopher Freeland's line. And the Mexicans saw where that was going and said, we're not going over the cliff with Canada. And they did a separate agreement. And then Trump said, we might let Canada in. And then Canada was left to beg their way back in. And then we got what we now call CUSMA and the USMCA. The point of it all is that a lot of this is really up to Canada. How do we approach these negotiations? Are we actually going to do what Brian Mulroney did back in the 80s and open markets, right? Then what did the Americans really want in the original free trade agreement? They wanted access, guaranteed access to oil and gas. And what did Brian Mulroney do? He said, you can have it.
Right.
As approach to negotiating trade, you got to put something on the table.
Yeah.
And I think if we do that, we'll be successful.
That's all the time we have. George, Mark, thank you so much. We've heard today about what the new Trump administration may mean for trade between Canada and the US. What should businesses and consumers expect? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.